All right, let's talk about The Beetle, an 1897 horror novel by Rchrd Mrsh, also aka Richard Bernard Heldeman, his actual name. This I picked up because Michael K. Vaughan is hosting his Rogers Cheap Old Book Club during the year, and this was the selection for May. I think they're all books that are from Project Gutenberg. This one falls within my remit of for my 1901 project, where I'm reading the history and novels and basically everything I can kind of glean about the period from 1890 to 1910, all centering around the year of my grandfather's birth in 1901. I'll put a link in the video to his video where he kind of announces all the titles for this year. Each month, he is reading a different title. While this wasn't like super successful as just a read, I did find I kind of great in other ways. So yeah, thank you, Michael, for pointing me in the direction to this one. So yeah, Rchrd Mrsh was born 1857, died in 1915. He was a best-selling, prolific author. He began publishing books as Rchrd Mrsh, it seems, after serving a sentence of hard labor for issuing forged checks in Britain and in France. So it's all about a horror story of this foreign creature, the beetle, which wants revenge on a British MP, Paul Lessingham, and it uses its hypnotic and shape-shifting power to try and enact that revenge. Like Dracula, which was published in the same year, it tells the story through various different POVs. For the Beetle, it's just four POVs that are sort of pretty much it's like one hunk, one hunk, one hunk, one hunk. They're all pretty much equal, I think basically equal length. So you start off with Richard Holt, who is a homeless former clerk who is taken control of by the Beetle and used against Paul Lessingham, a radical member of the opposition in the British Parliament. Then we go to Sidney Atherton, a scientist bent on making weapons of mass destruction for the coming wars. As he says, I went into my laboratory to plan murder, legalize murder on the biggest scale it has ever been planned, which, you know, as a novel that's written before World War One and talks about, you know, the mustard gas and all that sort of stuff. That's an interesting choice as a one of the quote unquote heroes of this section. He also likes to kill cats to demonstrate the lethality of his work, which really endears you to him. He is also a friend of since childhood of Marjorie Linden, and suddenly becomes convinced that he's actually in love with her when he discovers that she is in love with Paul Lessingham. So then we get on to the next section is from the point of view of Miss Marjorie Linden, a daughter to a blustering, very conservative member of Parliament, high up muckety muck, who is super incensed that his daughter is in love with Lessingham and is ignoring his commands as to, you know, how she should remove herself. She loves Paul Lessingham so much that she inserts herself into the investigation of the Beetle, this foreign figure. And then the final section is Augustus Champnell, a confidential agent, basically, I believe, just sort of a private investigator hired by Lessingham and Atherton to help track down the Beetle once things go very wrong. So, you know, overall, I found the first section of this kind of very creepy. But after that, it really started to drag for me. There is a fair amount of kind of doubling back on the POVs of you start hearing about things from different points of view, and it gets by the end it gets very distant. I as I went along, I got more and more frustrated. I started off with a copy from Project Gutenberg, where I was reading it on ebook, but it was like it was taking me so long to get through it that I also switched to listening to it on LibriVox, the free site where volunteers will read out books that are out of copyright. Actually, the woman who reads the Marjorie Lessingham section, there's different readers for each section. She does a really good job. The other three, or if it is three, are okay. Are okay. I mean, it's volunteers doing it. I didn't have to pay for it. I do not have a Audible subscription or anything like that. So, I'm quite grateful to that, and it helped me kind of power through the book a little bit quicker. I could listen to it as I was biking to work and things like that. Um, you know, the things that I really valued about this book is like, horror is great at tapping into what are the anxieties, the disquiets, the fears of a time. And this book, which was hugely popular, more popular than Dracula initially at the time, they really responded to it. And you can see that there's like a lot of those kind of fears that seem to have gotten tapped in. I mean, starting off with the fear of the foreigner. I mean, that's what Dracula is in a lot of ways. He's the foreigner who's come and is menacing the women. And indeed, the beetle is also very much that. This is a part. This seems to come. Paul Lessingham ventured to, I think it's Sudan in Africa, where he encountered this creature's people, and through some did something that really pissed off that creature. And now there's revenge. So there's this idea of you get the idea of like a very colonial country like the UK sticking its nose in places, exploiting people, all that, and there being that anxiety of like what's going to kind of come back on us. And of course, there is a cult in this book that wants to sacrifice white women to their god after committing unspeakable atrocities against them. So there's that, foreigners coming for our women, that kind of trope thing there, aka again something like Dracula. But there's also, especially at the very beginning of this book with the Richard Holt section, there's this fear of the submission enthrallment of British male. Richard Holt, he is hypnotized, stripped naked, and kissed by the male presenting creature known as the beetle. So the beetle is this like kind of man creature with a small hairless head, almost no chin, all eyes, very much I get the sense of kind of Gollum-like from the Lord of the Rings idea of kind of these animated feature of like kind of these lamp-like eyes that are mesmerism, hypnotism, very much a big thing of this disquiet of it's like you're going to be taken over mentally and it's going to unlock all this terrible stuff within. And the beetle is presented as monstrous, not only for its shape, for being this a beetle, but because kind of freaks out the characters of like, who is this a male? Is this a female? It's never fixed. Goodness alone knows what the infernal conjurer's real sex may be. Most of the things through the book, they always use the he pronoun, but we see some evidence to the contrary. But in there, this really, I think, slides into kind of the idea of what I learned of in when I took Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in university is the kind of the gay panic novel with the kind of this disquiet of, oh my God, homosexuality, in stuff like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, even stuff like, Dorian Gray, and so the disquiet over sexuality outside of the heterosexual, and, this obviously resulting in super harsh repression, with, most tragically, Oscar Wilde, not most, but most known wise by Oscar Wilde. But yeah, you have like Holt saying, as he falls under the beetle's power, for the time I was no longer a man. My manhood was merged in his. I was, in the extremest sense, an example of passive obedience. And I do think the idea of a passive is more than just kind of being hypnotized. I think there's the idea of being the passive partner in a homosexual relationship. That idea, and I would also group this. This gets carried through where you get Atherton kind of recognizing Paul Lessingham's beauty, that Paul Lessingham's powers of attraction on both male and female, and I'd group it in with Marjorie Linden later in the thing. What happens to her later in the novel, which the male characters certainly reflect as a kind of a moral outrage against her womanhood, which to a modern audience would seem like, okay, she's been assaulted, but there's much more. Her womanhood has been pulled apart at a certain point in the novel, not to go into kind of spoilers there. And there is kind of this idea of the destabilizing force of persuasion, the connection between the Beatles' hypnotic powers of persuasion and the power of Lessingham's great speech in the Parliament, where he even wins over, kind of for a time, his rival Atherton to his side. It was just like how powerful his speech is. And there's a sort of a thing there of kind of this radical politician being able to sway people onto his side, and perhaps that being also equally as frightening as the foreign beetle being able to hypnotize and take over the protagonists of the novel. This does the good thing of a horror novel, where it presents you with a bunch of protagonists who all have their I don't know if it's like failings or weaknesses. You've got Holt, this clerk who has kind of fallen down the ladder, losing job after job until finally he has no job and he's homeless. And even at the beginning of the novel, he can't even get into a homeless shelter. He gets turned away from that, and that's what helps him end up falling into the clutches of the beetle. You got Atherton, who is eagerly using his science to come up with ways of mass murder. He's kind of presented as the man of genius in this book, but there's also just like he's coming up with ways to slaughter thousands and thousands of people, and especially looking at it in retrospect over the course of the next two world wars that are going to come after or in between us and this horror novel. It's like, oh my God, he is kind of a very disturbing figure in itself, and not just for killing killing Lessingham's cat just kind of for kicks is just like in there. And then you have like Lessingham himself, Paul Lessingham himself, who is this kind of seemingly masterful politician, but is actually kind of deeply traumatized and wounded by his experiences as a young man in the Sudan, where he has been warped and he has a deep underlying vulnerability, and is often kind of termed in these manners of being hysterical as a woman. I mean, there's definitely a thing of like, oh, you are acting like a woman. That is wrong right now. And how much that is a weakness. And it's only when he acts like a man that like Atherton will respect him. And then you got like Marjorie Linden, who is very much, you probably is considered an example of the new woman, in that she's ignoring her father and going off with this radical politician. So not only is it politically radical, but it's also like, you are not obeying the patriarch, the father here. And there's that kind of, there's like, when teenagers have sex in a horror movie, that means they deserve to die. There is that sense of, these are all three figures who are doing things that are disturbing the order, and so they are going to deserve, I mean that in heavy quotations, the evil that this sexually ambiguous foreign creature is going to visit upon them. Now, the one of the major problems I have with the novel is that it ends with Augustus Chapnell, this confidential agent, this PI. And I mean, I'm not going to go into the details, but it's kind of like akin to the boring psychiatrist that no one remembers at the end of Psycho. It's like we have all of Psycho, and then for those first last couple of minutes, you just have this boring psychologist kind of try and fit order back on top of that, and by giving you kind of a gobbledygook speech of oh, how he felt, what he thinks was the was wrong, but it's a scientific explanation. Unfortunately, this is the entire end of the novel, this end last quarter of the novel that gets this treatment. And it's like where you feel like the book should be getting deeper, more psychological, more kind of into the madness of the beetle and its victims. It kind of retreats out, it pulls back and looks at it. Like, I would have loved this section from Marjorie Linden's section. Like, this should have been the section that should have been from her point of view. But it retreats to a very like, okay, we're going to step back. This is too disturbing. We're going to retreat back from this and look at it from the outside and have kind of just the plotting, methodical procedure of the PI and the police tracking down this creature. And indeed, like at the end, it's not like anything the characters do that seems to stop the beetle. It's outside of them that does that. And even like the threat back in the home country seems to just come out of nowhere, of like, oh no, we're stopping this, right now. And it's even through like the ending of this novel, of like it underlines how, okay, we've had all this kind of weird stuff with sexuality and stuff like this. We are going to put it back to normal right now. We're gonna, anything of like disquieting gender and sexual issues, it's like everybody who survives is going to get married. Don't worry, heterosexual relationships approved by the church and the state are going to be settled at the end, which is like, it's like, so I can see why the book, aside from its pacing, wouldn't resonate today. We still like, Dracula really resonates today. There's that fear of the outsider. There's the kind of the sexuality and stuff like that. This book, not so much. How that said, it's really is interesting to look at it from like, okay, what were the things of, you got the new woman, you've got like kind of the foreign, you've got the kind of this roiling kind of sexuality, you've got just the kind of bubbling thing of the unconscious kind of going around in here. I really need to get around to reading Freud, who is also starting to publish his major works at this time. Not that I'd say he's the end all and be all, but he's the first major look at this from this time period's point of view. So while it was a plod to get through, this was a plod to get through, it does have a lot of interesting stuff to kind of dig into in there. There's some books where you're like, oh, that was a great read, and then there's some books which are like, oh, that was kind of a boring read, but when you talk about it afterwards, there's a lot to talk about. So yeah, that is The Beetle by Rchrd Mrsh. Thank you, Michael. That was interesting. That was very interesting and cheap. Gotta like cheap as well. All right, more videos later.